my pleasure to welcome each of you to Count Me In, Why the Census Matters So Much to Our Community. Voteless People is a Hopeless People is one of Alpha's national programs focused on voter education and civic engagement. On behalf of Theta Lambda, which has been committed to serving Arlington and Alexandria since 1964, we are pleased to have partnered with the Arlington branch of the NAACP to bring you this evening's dynamic panel discussion, which will be moderated by my fraternity brother and committee co-chair, George Griffin. Before we get started, I would like to offer a few housekeeping rules. All participants have been muted and are requested to keep your cameras off for the duration of the panel to limit distractions. There will be time allotted for question and answer at the end of the forum, and audience members should submit their question through the group chat feature and identify to whom the question is being asked. Lastly, we are recording this session to allow for posting at a later date. So without further ado, George, take it away.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Chairman Conyers. We're really excited tonight to be joined by a really impressive group of thought leaders who are instrumental in helping us understand why the 2020 census matters. So we'll start today by doing a quick introduction. Each panelist will have the ability to introduce themselves, and we'll go ahead and start with our very own Mr. Julius D. Spain of the NAACP.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you to Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity for the NAACP in this collab event today as we talk about Census 2020. This is the first time in many years that Alpha Phi Alpha and the Arlington branch of the NAACP has worked together in this level of civic engagement, and I look forward to tonight's meeting. With that being said, I am the president of Arlington branch NAACP, where I've served for a little bit over a year, but I'm also the regional vice president, Region 3 North of the Virginia State Conference of the NAACP. The NAACP has been on the battleground, the forefront of working with the Census 2020, as you know, our communities of color have definitely been undercounted over the years. And we're gonna talk more about that tonight. But for some of my time, what I wanna do is allow Ms. E.J. Scott, who's chair of our environmental committee at NAACP level, to say a few words. E.J.?
Thank you very much, Julius. I'm sorry to be an interloper. I thought this was just going to be a regular meeting, but I am the chair of the Economic Development Committee for the state, for the Virginia State Conference. And with the impact of COVID, I know that everyone understands that it's going to severely and already has affected our community. So we're going to be a real watchdog for that. And I wanted to solicit from the Arlington branch some people to sit on that committee. So if you would please just find some folks from you're willing to be part of that, I would be ever grateful. President Span, thank you.
Thank you. That's all I have. Back to you, George.
Great, thanks so much. And we'd like to continue our introductions with the Honorable John Chapman.
Good evening. Good evening to Theta Lambda brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Also, good evening to Brother President of Arlington NAACP, Julius Spain. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk to the folks gathered here today about the census and what it means on a local level. I think for a lot of us, filling out a form for the census when we do doesn't really necessarily compute on how important that is. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about how important filling out that census is and how that importance cannot be understated, what that means in real dollars to your community and for your representation. So thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Great, thanks for joining us. We'll also like to continue with introductions with Ms. Wanda Pierce.
Well, good evening, and I want to thank the Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity and the Arlington NAACP for having me as part of this panel discussion. I've been a member of the Arlington County Green Valley community for 32 years. And as such, I'm a newbie. And what I mean by that is the African American community in Green Valley goes back generations. So even though I've been here 32 years, I'm basically a newbie. I have been very involved in Arlington County civic activities, having also been the executive director of the Arlington Community Foundation, from which I retired in 2017. And as part of my desire to give back, I accepted the invitation of the County Manager of Arlington, Mark Schwartz, to lead what's called the Complete Count Committee for the 2020 Census for Arlington. And it was important to me because, number one, representation is key to everything we do here in the community. We want to make sure that we have the dollars as well as the representation in Congress. And so I accepted the challenge to become co-chair of the Complete Count Committee. And when I say challenge, it's a challenge because we're asking some people to come out and to be counted in the middle of an election season where they're being asked to vote, and there's different criteria for different things. And then also now that we're facing this COVID pandemic, it makes the challenge even greater. But what has been found in recent, basically all census in the last several decades is that there are groups that are significantly undercounted. And so the African-American community is one of those groups, as well as the Latino community. And so I'm dedicated to leading this committee to try to increase the count to make sure that everyone is counted in Arlington.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining us. And we'll continue with Mr. Hansel Aguilar.
Good evening. I just want to thank the moderators and the organizers for this event. This is a great event that we're having, and the community members and community leaders are present here today to look at this discussion. And if you're not, if you're subsequently viewing it after this live discussion, I definitely encourage you to become more involved in this process, very important process. My name is Hansel Aguilar. I'm originally from Honduras. I moved to the United States a few years ago, about 20 years or so ago. I'm new to the area, more or less. I'm celebrating my 10th year in Virginia, in Northern Virginia. I grew up in Jersey. I love this area. I like to get involved as much as I can in different things. And so my role with the census was a natural role for me. It's a partnership specialist. And I work with community organizations like the NAACP, like Alpha Phi Alpha, and also local jurisdictions like in Arlington and Alexandria, to make sure that we're raising awareness about what the census is, the importance of us participating in it. So I really thank you for allowing me to be part of the discussion today. And I think this is a great example of what the importance is of partnerships and raising awareness in the census.
Great, thank you so much for joining us. So to frame our time together today, we'll be getting to enter a panelist Q&A session. As we do our panelist Q&A session, we will then, at the conclusion of the panelist Q&A, have the ability for the audience to participate in asking questions as well through the chat feature. But in terms to kick off our panelist Q&A, we'd like to start again with Mr. Hansel to begin to kind of let us know what is the importance of the census and why is it something that's so important? Like, what is the census?
Great, yes, and thank you for allowing me to start off the discussion. So the census is the complete count of every person living in the United States. It's been done since the 1700s. So it's something that it's very steeped in our history in the country. It's actually very important. It's the fabric of our democracy. It's important that we make sure that every individual living in the country is counted, regardless of race, creed, any status. So the census count is just making sure, excuse me, we're counting individuals residing, excuse me, we're counting individuals residing in the U.S. at that time. It is actually mandated by the Constitution. Oh, excuse me. And it's very important for two main reasons, about many different reasons. There's two main reasons that we communicate to the public. One reason is because it helps us do the apportionment process. That is the process by which we allocate the seats for the U.S. House of Representatives. So it's directly tied to our democracy in that way. It's also tied to our democracy in terms of funding. Over 675 billion funds are distributed at the state level and the local level. And we're going to go into more in depth about how that funding impacts our communities. It's also important for redistricting at the federal level, but also at the state and local level. And I do actually want to give a shout out to the NAACP and see the importance that this institution and members have had with census. W.E.B. Du Bois is actually listed as our notable alumni in the census website for his usage of census statistics. And the way that he used it in his day, he was really challenging racist narratives by looking at statistics of Black farmers. And that's also a very important piece of this. It really helps us tell a full and complete story when we have accurate data. And especially in times like this, when we need to make sure we're making evidence-based decisions and we're allocating funds equitably, it's important to have this information and this data.
And we definitely understand the importance of it, so we really appreciate that. In terms of kind of understanding how the confidentiality of the census is maintained, Mr. Hansel, can you kind of let us know a little bit more information about how we're ensuring that it's confidential?
Absolutely. So that's an important piece of this, and it's really important because the census is by law, is mandated by law. So in order for any process where it's mandated by law, you got to make sure that individuals feel comfortable with it. And this process is very secure and it's confidential and it's protected by law. There's Title 13 of the U.S. Code, which protects the information that's being collected. There is personal private information being collected on the household members. So by law, this information, Title 13, cannot be shared with any organization, any agency. So there's actually all these census employees that are participating in our work and in this process actually have to take an oath to make sure that they protect the data. And if there's any disclosure of the data, there's actually imprisonment and fines that individual could face. So it's something that is very steeped into this process, making sure that the data is protected. This is the first year that the census is going to be done online. So part of it is an option to do it online. So there's actually a lot of cybersecurity surrounding that information. And there's also a lot of statistical security in terms of making sure when the information is actually presented to the public and to the various stakeholders, that you won't be able to identify the information about particular neighborhoods. It's done at a census tract level, which it's broad enough that you won't know specifically who lives in what house and won't disclose or won't be revealing any information about any particular individual, family, or household.
Perfect. And Ms. Pierce, I guess would like to kind of follow that up by kind of talking about how the participation has been here locally, particularly right now. I think we're showing the stats for both Arlington and Alexandria, but we'd love to get your feedback on how participation has been going here locally.
Okay. Well, Arlington, in terms of compared to the nation as well as the rest of the state, we're above average. But when you look within Arlington at the various communities, we do see that some of the communities that are predominantly immigrant or African-American, or largely, not predominantly, but largely, are below the average rate of the response rates. So we look at those communities as hard to count communities. And so we're looking at different methods to try to raise awareness and to get folks to actually come out and be counted. One of the things that we're encouraging with our committee, which is a very diverse committee, we have lots of different groups that are doing outreach to local groups, and we're doing more online, obviously, because a lot of our events have had to be postponed. but there is an extra push to try to get those that are undercounted within our average rate at least.
Perfect. Any other panelists want to weigh in on this particular question regarding the local response? Perfect. Well, moving right along, in terms of Mr. Spain, would love to kind of understand, in terms of the NAACP, I know that it's partnered with an international GIO system in terms of providing mapping licenses to examine the census response rate in real time. Also, want to kind of understand the other technology that the NAACP has been using to ensure that folks are actively participating in the census and getting their data submitted.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's some great software out there that's being used. Esri is a mapping license that the NAACP has that we're using nationwide. Arlington branch of the NAACP, we're still waiting on our access, so we lean heavily on our state and national partners, more especially Jamal Watkins and his team at Civic Engagement to give us those numbers as needed. But yes, the NAACP, not just here in Arlington and the Commonwealth of Virginia, is heavily engaged in Census 2020. Just a few days ago, our team at the Census had a focused webinar on Michigan, right, the Detroit area, in the Census 2020 campaign. So NAACP, along with its many partners, has the tools to be successful. And what we're doing now is being out there collabing, having events like this, encouraging people in our community, more especially our people of color, to get involved, because we know even in the past, in 2010, we didn't have a lot of high turnout, despite what may be happening here in Arlington. And I'm looking at the numbers, around 60% we still have those pockets within Alexandria and Arlington that we need to focus on. And that's what the NAACP is for. Even though we may be small in numbers, we pack a pretty good punch, and we're going to do whatever it takes to get people involved, even if it means completing the census online.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And Councilmember Chapman, can you talk through how local government is impacted by the census, and perhaps provide some examples so that folks on the call can understand how this directly impacts their communities, whether it be playground funding, funding for community block grants, district representation, or redistricting? Can you kind of talk through the local impact on local government as well?
Certainly. So as it relates to representation, that was a great point. And I think Hansel also spoke to that as well. Representation is something in terms of redistricting. If, for instance, if Alexandria or Arlington over the next 10 years were to have a very dramatic change in the population, we would be looking at changes in representation as it relates to federal. We haven't had that significant of a shift. We have seen additional numbers, but not enough to trigger kind of redistricting. But from a local government standpoint, your participation in the census is much needed. We see on a regular basis, I see on council, a number of opportunities for us to receive federal money that is impacted by our residents completing or not completing the census. Our city staff estimates that for every 1% of Alexandrians that do not fill out the census, Alexandria loses $18 million over a course of 10 years. Wow. And so we talk about having, and I think Alexandria was maybe at 64% in terms of self-reporting. If that number were to never go up, imagine exactly what we would be losing. We'd be losing upwards of $30 million a year. So that is quite the number. And we see that number come through Alexandria in a number of different ways. I just made a short list. One of the biggest things that we talk about in this region is housing and the cost of housing. Section 8 choice vouchers are a big help to those who cannot afford to have rental housing here. We have a local housing authority that gives out those Section 8 vouchers and works with tenants to find appropriate units. And so they are very much dependent on those federal funds in order to keep up those units and sometimes expand the number of Section 8 units that we have. And so by folks not filling out the census and us being undercounted, especially vulnerable populations and populations of color, that unfortunately more than likely, more than others rely on some of that housing support. If we're not getting the maximum amount that we can get, we will lose out, and it will be reflected in real housing units. Another area, particularly Black and Brown folks do use is what's called TANF, temporary assistance for needy families, support. Those financial supports go to support a number of our at-risk families. And so those federal funds come directly to the locality to be spent on housing assistance, energy assistance, rent assistance, and food assistance as well. Alexandria is trying, as Arlington is as well, trying to do a much better job with preschool education and making sure all of our young people, especially our very young people, come ready to kindergarten, ready to learn. And a way that's reflected in federal funding is through the Head Start program. The program itself, but also some of the monies that it will give to localities to run kind of pre-K and kindergarten readiness programs. And so not being able not to have that full funding is going to have that impact as well. You did mention, Brother Griffin, you did mention community block grants. Those are a wonderful source of resources for a local community because they are flexible. For decades, Alexandria has used most of its community block grants for housing to offset some of the housing projects here that we want to get started that are affordable. And so we've used that money to give out loans, give out grants to nonprofit developers in order for them to create more affordable housing. But in that flexibility, we do have the opportunity with community block grants to use them for other designated sources. And so one of the things that we're doing now is exploring the use of community development block grants to support some of those folks that are struggling with COVID and struggling with having a lack of resources during COVID, such as housing assistance, but also food assistance as well. And so we are seeing how we can maximize the use of those community block grants while we get them. But again, and I keep going back to this, if folks do not fill out their census, we don't get those community block grants as big as we do because of the formula for them. I think there was, Ms. Pierce, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to just add a couple of statistics from the Arlington point of view. We receive about $50 million from federal government funding, and 20 million of that is the housing and urban development things, such as Alexandria gets the CBD grants, the Section 8, some Homeland Security monies. We also receive about $10 million from the Department of Transportation related to transportation projects. And then, of course, school national program. We get about $4.5 million. We're looking at Section 8, it's about $18.7 million. So there's a lot of funds just that mirror kind of what Alexandria is experiencing that we could lose out on. And when you bring it down to the individual, for each person that is undercounted, they're estimating it's anywhere between $1,500 and $2,000 a person that we're losing out. If you then multiply that by 10 for 10 years, because whatever number we are given in the census, it lasts for 10 years. So if we lose $2,000 per person, that's $20,000 per person that is undercounted, and that brings it down to the individual level. So if you're looking at all these different projects across the county, totaling over $50, it's imperative that we maximize the count.
Our folks did a calculation for our per person number, and we're sitting at about 1,200 per person. And so every person that's counted or not counted, equates to about $1,200 in federal assistance. And so, like was said by Ms. Pierce, it is essential that we get out the count and raise that number as high as we can go.
Most certainly. Thank you very much for letting us know that those powerful statistics as well.
Hey, George,
Mhm.
if you don't mind, I just want to caveat a little bit about what Ms. Pierce mentioned. I just want to bring up some statistics that the NAACP has shared broadly as it relates to some of the biases that we're seeing even in our census outreach. And for those that are listening in, and just pay strict attention to these numbers. And then compare and contrast a state like California that's spending $187 million to ensure an accurate count of the population. That's California, okay? But then let's think about Texas, and where the legislature decided not to devote any money on the job. And 24 states like Texas are not spending any money at all. So you could take that for what it's worth. And what does that say? We're talking about trying to get a complete count of everyone. There's going to be a number of people in those red states, Republican states, unfortunately, that are not going to be counted. And the state itself has not devoted or has not allowed it any funds at all. So kudos to what's going on in Arlington. But for those of you that's listening on the call, it's also imperative that in our outreach efforts that we extend beyond Alexandria and Arlington to your friends and family outside of the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for letting us know that. That's alarming in some regards.
Yes.
Speaking of the count, Mr. Aguilera, can you kind of let us know, particularly in terms of, keeping in mind that COVID-19 is on and rampant. I know that we're going to be going door to door, but what can families anticipate in this process now in light of COVID-19 in terms of the Census Bureau themselves trying to ensure that they're counted?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So as I mentioned, this is the first year where the census has an option of filling it out online. So that's it just happened to happen on this year with these circumstances. So that's some great foresight, but also in terms of where we are with technology, where we can do this. So that's something that we're really making sure we're pushing it forward in the community in terms of messaging, that there is an online option. We understand for various reasons that not everybody feels comfortable with technology. So there are other options. That's not the only option. But I do have a coworker that's been pushing a unofficial slogan, which I'd like to borrow here. He's saying that the best response is the self-response. And that I think that really it's really what we want people to do. They want people encouraged to be part of this process. So if you don't feel comfortable going online to my census, my 2020 census.gov, you can also call. There's a phone number you can contact. In mid-March, the 95% of U.S. households were sent invitations to participate. Census Day officially kicked off on April 1st. So that's essentially the day that we're working in terms of the base, in terms of counting individuals that were in your household. So keep that in mind when you're filling out your census. You can go online, you can contact the phone number, and I'll put it in the chat for the public. And also your paper form, that's also another option. Households are starting to receive the paper forms. Now, traditionally, the process has been allow people to self-respond. Then there's a cutoff where after the households haven't self-responded, the enumerators, the census takers start knocking on doors. Because of COVID, as you mentioned, those timeframes were moved a little bit. So the knocking on doors for the non-self-response, it hasn't started yet, but it will be starting soon. But you still have the opportunity to self-respond up to October 31st. That's the new deadline to self-respond. However, they are going to start, the census takers are going to start knocking on doors on August 11th. But be mindful that we're still monitoring the situation. So some jurisdictions, it may not be feasible, it may not be allowable to do that. So that's something to take into account. But August 11th is the projected date for that. And that process will be all the way to October 31st. But if you can, try to self-respond by the 3 methods I mentioned, either going online, either contacting the phone number, or filling out the paper form. And also, if you have community members or family members that don't speak English, there's it's available in 13 different languages, but also there's language guides in 59 different languages. And that combination actually covers 99% of the languages spoken in the United States. So there's a lot of ways to make sure that everybody gets counted in this process.
That's really important. Thank you so much for sharing that. Ms. Pierce, speaking of COVID-19, can you kind of let the audience know essentially how has the pandemic affected the response rate? As we know, some families may have faced financial difficulty and may not be able to retain their internet access. So can you kind of talk about response rates in light of COVID-19?
Well, we're worried. I mean, we don't have figures saying what it would have been without COVID. We just don't know. But we do know that our efforts of this 42-member committee have had to go in a different direction. So instead of having many sorts of opportunities for in-person solicitation of folks and encouragement of folks to respond. So for instance, a lot of our partners are places of worship in the minority community. We've had, mosques, churches, and those are not places that people are going in person now. So we're really counting on online efforts of all of our trusted advisors, the leaders of various organizations, to get the word out in the ways that they're gathering now, meaning over the internet. So we're sure that it's not as high as it would be if we had the in-person, but we feel that we can use technology to get in touch with as many groups as possible. So we have what's called a partnership campaign on the Arlington County website, where any group such as the Alphas can become partners and use their network to get the word out to take the census. We were also concerned early on, even before COVID, that the president's desire to have a census question on, a citizenship question on the census was lowering the rate. That is, the Supreme Court is not allowing that, but still the damage is done. Folks are very suspicious. But we don't have the statistics, like how many would have if they didn't have that. But we know that it's impacting, especially immigrant groups, to come out and to be counted. You don't have to be a citizen to be counted. We want, anyone that's using services, anyone that gets on a bus or that has a, Head Start and is in Head Start program or anything related to the funding that we receive, we want to make sure they're counted. So we're redoubling our efforts in other ways. One example I just want to mention is, for instance, the Arlington Food Assistance Center is one of our partners. They reach a lot of the hard to count population. Normally, they would have lots of people in their waiting room waiting to get food, and they would be handing out pamphlets and stuff. Well, can't do that. We have to modify, just as they've had to modify their operation. So we're trying to send messages with anything that they're sending out to tell people where they can come and pick up food. We're also still getting the message out about taking the census, and we're hoping that those trusted advisors are also getting the word out for us. But to answer your original question, we just don't know the statistics before and after any of these unfortunate occurrences, whether it's the citizenship question or whether it's COVID. All we know is our job's a lot harder, so we have to redouble our efforts, just like in voting. Everyone has to redouble our efforts because we have to get over these hurdles. The good thing about it, I know, at least in the African American community, we have a long history of overcoming hurdles. And so we just have to encourage everybody to head and be counted. And if I can just make one other point, when it comes to being counted, everyone in your household needs to be counted. So sometimes if we have a lot of people living, let's say living in our household, we say, oh, we only want to count like 2 or 3 or not all the kids. No, count all the kids. Everybody needs to be counted, because A baby that's 2 weeks old gets that same amount of funding and when they're counted as someone that, you know, in their 90s. So everyone, even if they're not related, anyone in that household must be counted.
Perfect. Thank you so much for ensuring that everyone in the households are counted. Mr. Spain, alluding to particularly people of color, what are the stakes for people of color? We talked about the stakes more broadly, but what are the stakes specifically for people of color, and keeping in mind Arlington and Alexandria?
Well, thank you for the question. So we know the Black community was 50% higher than any other racial group back in the 2010 census to be undercounted. So when you look at, even though we're at 60-some% now here in Arlington, and undercount in Arlington and Alexandria, where we have high immigrant populations, could result in diminished representation for monies of our state, which means we all lose in the end, right? So again, this is what we're doing tonight is all about, right? This type of advocacy, boots on the ground, getting out, whether it's virtual, is very important, because if people aren't counted, whether it's everybody in the household, right, Wanda?
Yes.
We're missing out. So we have to do our due diligence to ensure, one, people know what the census is all about, but ensure that they complete the census, right? We all know, we've talked earlier about lack of representation, lack of funding, and monies alike. So the way we articulate that, right, to the people and kind of give them some reassurance. You know, Hansel talked about how people are kind of nervous about, hey, putting certain things on the application and whether they're going to be targeted. You know, we got to reassure them that your information is private, right? And I know the NAACP National has already talked about if there's any forms of people misusing of data in the census, we're going to court, right? So just rest assured that you have people, organizations like the NAACP who are going to have your back, and we just need everyone to participate. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councilmember Chapman, I think for a lot of folks, we understand it and we definitely appreciate the first response, but kind of want to better understand specifically locally how resources are allocated as a result of the census. So, you know, what are the types of projects that people see in their community that the funding comes from people's response rates?
So I'd start with one of the easiest ones that folks are going to see is street repair. You know, street paving, our street paving program actually comes from the federal government to the states to the localities. So it's many times a pass through. But a lot of that is done through an algorithm based on the number of people that we have in the city. And so every time you use streets and you see repaved streets, part of that, a large part of that money comes from the federal government. Again, you know, we spoke to housing. Housing is a big one in our area. As you see a number of these more affordable housing projects go up, a lot of that gap money is usually going to be from federal resources. And whether it's a community block grant or direct federal housing funding, that money comes to our city as a big pot based on the number of people that we have that's counted in our census. Because we're expected to grow by a certain amount over the next 10 years. And year 8, 9, and 10, that number is going to be based on the response that we got from the 2020 census. And so as you see certain projects going up in your community, find out they're affordable, know that a decent portion of that money has come from the federal government. For our school system, we only really get a small little chunk from the federal government. It's about, I think it was $0.29 million. But you multiply that by 10, that becomes a greater number. But that amount, again, is a equation that's given by the federal government to us in terms of money. And so some of those supports are easy to see, such as roads and buildings. Some of them are not as easy to see, such as some of the preschool programs, some of the lunch and food programs that we've already talked about. For our Black and Brown communities, essentially, or specifically, those communities, we have a lot of supports, emergency funds and emergency supports that support those who are struggling to stay here and live here. some of our at-risk communities. It is very expensive to try to provide that as a local government. And so we rely on that federal assistance for TANF, for SNAP, which is Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. Some of those SNAP funds. And localities like Alexandria and Arlington have expanded the use of SNAP funds. So it's not just kind of canned foods and foods that aren't necessarily healthy in the long term. It's being able to go to a farmer's market. Alexandria has actually a doubling program where we double the amount of SNAP dollars that somebody brings to a farmer's market in order for them to get those fresh fruits and vegetables that are needed in their diet. And so being able to provide those SNAP, not only the doubling, but the actual SNAP benefits from the federal government is essential. And so again, by filling out your census and encouraging those around you, whether they be family members, community members, or otherwise, to fill that form out is essential for our localities to receive that federal benefit, which disproportionately is going to help Black and Brown people.
Thank you so much for that. Mr. Aguilar, we do, I know it's been mentioned on this call specifically around the national concern that developed over that citizenship question. But I guess what has the Census Bureau been doing, or how is it committed to counting everyone? Or can you kind of define, regardless of citizenship, how the U.S. Census Bureau is still ensuring that we're counting everyone?
Sure. I think the partnership program is a great example of that. The messaging through the integrated communications plan that we have is very important, because we're not just giving a standard message. We're working with the communities impacted, most impacted, the hardest to count, to making sure that we're working with them and making sure they understand the importance of this process. As the various panels have mentioned, the council member and Ms. Pierce and then NAACP, that there are reasons and there are generalized mistrust in this process. And I think it's really important for us to just continue to raise awareness. The Census Bureau has targeted campaigns, and targeted in terms of making sure that they fit the community that they're trying to reach out to, not just a standard message, but trying to make sure that community members know the impact for their community. And for when I engage in community discussions, at the end of the day, this is a contract or a limited term role for me. At the end of the census period, I'm gonna go back to my regular life, whatever that looks like. But I'm a community member, and this is gonna impact me and my family. One of my first census presentations that I made was to my niece who's in middle school, and I wanted to make sure she understood the process and she was comfortable in the understanding it. So I designated her as kind of the household lead for the census. And just in that very small, I guess, act, I think I'm trying to demonstrate the importance of having these community discussions. The census does it at the national level with national partnerships, strategic partnerships, at the local level with the community leaders, making sure that we're providing them the resources and providing the communication they need to message to the community. So I think in various different ways, the Census Bureau has been participating in this process, but it's gonna take a lot of civil society response to make sure we meet everybody, we count everybody that's in our communities.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Pierce, how are we ensuring that individuals are not being counted twice, and ensuring that households, again, you did mention that everyone in the household needs to be counted, but how do we ensure that we are capturing everyone in the household and not counting folks twice?
Well, I think after I answer the question, I think Hansel should answer that, because the Census Bureau is actually the folks that have this final word. But what we're telling folks is that, go ahead and count everybody. And then if somehow, let's say you have a college student or someone that accidentally gets counted somewhere else, the Census Bureau is going to figure that out. They're going to see the double counting. So just go ahead and assume that someone has not been counted somewhere else. As I mentioned, it is a count by household. So it is possible that, someone could fill it out and then a spouse or someone can at another location just fill it out. Excuse me. And then there's a double count, but I'm pretty sure that the census comes at the end. They go back and they do this check to see if there's been double counting. Is that correct, Ansel?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for that. That's absolutely accurate. So at the back end, and that's actually some of the reason why we ask some of the questions. Like you might see a name question there, you might see date of birth, and you might be wondering, well, if you're just trying to count everybody, what does my name matter? But this actually helps us in this back end kind of things when we're looking at the data, making sure we're counting everybody only once, and in the right place. Because of COVID, there's a lot of people might have been migrating internally. The students, the college students we know were sent back home. So that has impacted the potential overcount or miscount. It can, in theory, but we're making sure we're working with the universities to make sure that they're informing the students that they should be counting themselves in the community that they were, where they are most of the year. But again, if there's any confusion, that's why we ask the questions, to make sure that we can clean it up. We may be able to follow up as well. We ask for a phone number contact. So we may be able to follow up with a household and say, we're just calling you to making sure that we got the information correct. If and when we return back to the field operations, we may also do audits to make sure that we got the correct information. So all of this is built into the process. Like Ms. Wanda, Ms. Pierce said, it's important that, when in doubt, make sure you get counted. Talk to your landlord, talk to your family members, your roommates. Make sure that you come up with a plan to make sure everybody gets counted. If for whatever reason you feel like you have a roommate you have been talking to and they might have received the form, and this has happened in past censuses where the roommates were having conflict and they received the census form and they left the roommate out. So if there's any confusion about that or concern about that, you can contact the number and say, hey, I just want to make sure that I was included in my household count, and they'll be able to look you up by your household code. So again, make sure that you're having these discussions with your family members, your landlords, your roommates.
Right, and then because it's counted by household, if there's someone that, like, let's say lives in your basement that's not related to you, that person gets counted as part of your household. Anyone that lives at that address, that's the key part, the address.
Certainly. Thank you so much for sharing that as well. And Mr. Stain, understanding that historically, people of color have been the most impacted by being undercounted, I guess what are the actionable steps that the NAACP is doing to combat that?
Okay, so thanks for the question. I spoke early on in this presentation about the direction NAACP National has provided to us as branches and state conferences, right? So we're just a mere extension of the national organization. What we're doing here today is in keeping with that, and also in keeping with a standing MOU between Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity and civic engagement. But as you asked that question, I took some notes earlier. What can we do to combat some of the issues that are going on? So listen, churches, our D9 organizations, social justice organizations, civic associations. I looked earlier, there was about 75 people on this call. If everyone went out after this meeting tomorrow and told someone, hey, or asked someone, did you participate in the census? We just tapped into 150 people. Tell those people to tap into another 75. That's how it works, right? That's low level engagement, but it can expand to unknown numbers, right? We need to do things like that, work at the grassroots level. And my capacity as not only president, but also as regional vice president, where I have 11 branches of the NAACP from Spotsylvania all the way up to Northern Virginia. What I've been doing is conveying to the branch presidents, right, and encouraging them to do the same that we're doing here tonight in their respective regions within Northern Virginia, and get the word out. We understand there's so many competing interests going on, and a lot of locales. We just went through elections. There's a lot going on with voting, but the census is very important. It's just as important, if not important, more important than voting itself. So those are just many ways we can go about combating the historical issues and misdealings that have gone on. It's about having a clear and concise message and articulating to our people of color what the census is all about, and to be informed and be engaged. Failure to be engaged, right, for the next 10 years means what? You don't get the resources. And this is one of the reasons why. So NAACP, I'll add again, I put a link up here for everyone. It's called makemyfamilycount.org. If the viewers go to that website is the link that the NAACP is using, and it shows all the partner organizations that we're aligned with and what we're doing to date as it relates to census. But as I talked earlier about Michigan, what NAACP has done, we have with that mapping software, right, that George have identified areas throughout the United States where we want our branches to be heavily engaged. And so I'm proud that we're doing that. But to answer your question, there's always more we can do, right? And I think tonight is just, an expansion of what's been going on already with Wanda Pearson, her group, and Hans on his team. This is terrific.
Perfect. And Councilmember Chapman, you mentioned earlier in your remarks that it's about $1,200 per person that's missed when folks do not participate. Can you kind of talk through that impact locally, and when you kind of take the magnitude of that, can you kind of talk through the impact of if folks don't participate? And I guess what's your message directly to those people?
The message is very simple. We need everybody counted. I think everybody on this call said that. From a very kind of individualized local level, if you kind of parse through the numbers for each person, even though we said it's 1,200, that impact over the course of 10 years is huge. Not only for our schools, not only for infrastructure like roads, not only for housing. You couple those three things that I just mentioned with a number of supports for our at-risk families. Like that is, and I don't want to kind of put all the focus on them, but that is a heavy piece of federal assistance. It really goes to our at-risk families. So if you are somebody that's not using Section 8, you're not using TANF, you're not using SNAP, and you don't fill out your census, you're actually hurting those folks who need that assistance because your locality is not getting the full brunt of that assistance for those families who could be helped. And so I think that's the real local impact, regardless of your personal financial situation. You not filling out a simple form such as the census is really not going to allow your locality to do everything that it can to help some of these families. Because as I think everybody on this call knows, localities' budgets are not endless. We can only really provide what our taxpayers allow us, frankly, to provide. And that has to be combined with state and federal funds. And the majority of these federal funds are going to come through the census process by different formulas that are used for different programs and how those monies are given out. Again, the big impact is for our at-risk families. They are going to rely on this federal funding, whether it's SNAP, whether it's TANF, or any number of other federal assistance programs. And if folks are not filling out their form, if we're not hitting that 100% or very upper 90s, let's say we're stuck at the 60s, that's going to have a drastic impact on the amount of aid that localities such as Alexandria and Arlington and others can give to our most at-risk, most needy families.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. And with that, we will be switching over to audience questions as well. So we can take some questions from the audience. We were going to allow the audience members to participate through the usage of the chat box. So if any members of the audience have any questions, now is your time to ask them. So please type those questions within the chat box. And I'll also ask our chairman, Conyers, to also help facilitate this portion in terms of ensuring that we're answering the questions in the order in which they've been asked as well. Of course, once we do call you, you can't and go live with this. But if you until you're called, that would also help ensure you.
It appears that a question has come in. We'd ask you all to maintain your mute function and just post your questions in the chat box. It appears that we have the first question available to Mr. Chapman, or Councilman Chapman, Brother Spain. Either of you, please answer. It's possible that communities of color are negatively impacted by how funds are distributed based on an algorithm. Does money go to repair roads instead of programs like SNAP or TANF when you have to sort of make that choice?
John, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I would say it's not impacted negatively by the algorithm. It's going to be negatively, those communities of color are going to be negatively impacted by the choices that local governments make with the funding. So for instance, in Alexandria, we have a list of streets that we're going to pave in any given year. Based on that list, certain communities are going to receive better roads. And so if your local governing body, whether it's city council, whether it's board of supervisors, is not making investments in certain neighborhoods on a regular basis, you would know that. But that really doesn't have to do with the formula per se. It really has to do more or less with the choices that are made by local government once they get their allocation of funding. That allocation of funding is not going to be based on the type of individuals within a community. It's solely going to be based on numbers. I think the undercount hurts because your locality then doesn't get the full amount of associated monies based on the actual people that they have based versus the number of people that are counted in the census. But again, a lot of the ones that funding is given out, that onus relies on the locality. As it relates to SNAP and TANF, for jurisdictions, it's not a choice of roads or SNAP or TANF. The government's going to give it in a number of different streams. There is a document, I think, produced by the Census Bureau that has a long list of government programs that are supported by the census, or the formula comes through the census. And it's not a choice of either or, because the government's going to give it to all of those programs based on the formula that they have. And so again, the locality is going to choose where roads are done. But as it relates to SNAP and TANF, it's based on the number of people that you have. And so if communities of color do not or undercounted, you're going to have more individuals that are in need of such services, but most likely not enough money.
Great, thank you, Councilman Chapman, for that insight. I think being able to kind of distinguish how choices are made and how that money is allocated has been particularly helpful. So thank you for that. The next question is an interesting one. So this individual is actually the child of an immigrant and certainly felt more empowered to address a lot of the concerns, or felt that this helped empower him to address a lot of the concerns that his family member has, given that they are not sort of native-born citizens. Mm-hmm. So the question here is there a mechanism to verify the census, like how it's been submitted and received? How do individual residents, how are they confirmed that their census has been recorded? Perhaps Hansel could answer that.
Sure. So when you there's a few ways. When you fill it out online, if you fill it out online, you actually get a confirmation number. You can keep a record of that. That's one way to verify and making sure that you've been counted in the process. Another way, as I mentioned, we can always contact the phone number provided. If you're interested, I could provide again at the end of this, so just you can have it available. But that way you can contact. You'll probably speak to somebody at what's called the ACO, the Area Census Office, which would be your local census office, and you'll speak to somebody there. Just say, "Hi, I just want to confirm that my household has been counted." So they'll ask you a few questions. If you received the invitation, you would have received a code there that's specific to your household. So they may ask you for that code. If you don't have it, that's not a problem. Another way they can check your particular household is you give them the address. They'll be able to look into the system and able to verify whether we have received the information or not. Be mindful if you are, as I mentioned, there's different ways to self-respond. If you did send it in the mail, just be mindful it might take a few days for us to receive it and then process it. So that's just, if you contact the number and you say, hey, I sent it in through mail, then we might have not received it when you're contacting it, but when you contact us, but you can feel free to contact us back. But if there's any doubt about whether you've been counted or not, feel free to contact us and we'll be able to look into that.
Great, thank you, Hansel. So the next question asks, why have we not focused or pushed more for the census, I guess, compared to the election or actual sort of voting for your government officials, whether that's at the state, local, or federal level? I think a lot of attention, particularly given this being a general election year, has been focused on that. But as you sort of alluded to, Councilman Chapman, or there may have been brothers, Mr. Spain, at any rate, the census may be just as important or maybe more so than the actual election. So can someone on the panel address that question?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it if that's okay. I think for us, it's a lot harder to visualize the impact of the census. For elections, you're voting for or against somebody. You know who that person is usually. You see their face, you've seen their slogan, you either like them or don't like them. For the census, we're asking you to fill out a piece of paper about yourself. While that seems super simple, there's nothing outside of some of the conversations that we're having now that really connects you to the real impact that you're having. You know, some of these stats that we've shared here are not widely known in our communities. I know I could probably go out and ask an average Alexandrian about how much they think their individual person brings in federal dollars. And I doubt most folks would say $1,200 because that information is not necessarily widely known, and it's not something that people keep on the top of their brains. So every 10 years, asking somebody to fill this out, either they forget the impact or that information really hasn't gotten to them. Also, you think about how often we vote. In Virginia, frankly, we vote pretty much every year. There's some election somewhere that we have to vote for. Filling out a census every 10 years does not kind of solidify this as something super important in a lot of people's minds. That's just my opinion.
Dale, I'm going to add something on there, and I echo everything that John just spoke about. And I'm just going to speak specifically to my dealings in and around Arlington, right? So I've been here since 2009, and to what John just spoke about, yeah, we vote every year here in Arlington. And it's almost like the news cycle, right? The census is at once every 10 years. But how we get this information out to the people in the community is, it is challenging, given that there's so many other levers, so many other things going on from day to day. And once again, to articulate to them the importance of the census. What I encourage everyone to do is, stay involved as much as possible. We have so many competing interests in Alexandria and Arlington as it relates to what can you do in your personal time. And the census, again, only comes once a year. But if you keep up with the NAACP and Alpha Phi Alpha and things, organizations such as that, you will see that we have things going every month, every quarter, something new comes up. So I would just encourage people to stay engaged with their local social justice organizations such as the NAACP and get involved.
I just sent a link to the Arlington County census page where we have a list of toolbox. We have a toolbox and a list of communication strategies that any organization can use to disseminate to their network about the importance of the census. I think in terms of, we've been at this since last April. It's trying to spread the word, getting people excited about the census. I think part of it is that the census is, it's unlike voting. It's not that you have to register to vote and then go through all these hoops and things that we really need to push. We really need a big effort to make sure people get signed up and are not prevented from voting. But the census, there's nothing to prevent anyone from doing the census other than fear. You can go, anyone can get on their computer right now, put in their address and take the census. But it's how you motivate people to do that. And part of it is just that there have been a lot of obstacles put in front of people in terms of fearing that the government is going to get into their confidential business, and it's not true. And so that's why it's so important that we get the word out. And even though there's an election and we're being drowned out in the media by lots of other things, that's why this is even more important, that all of our partners and organizations across the country, especially in the minority community, go ahead and encourage people to take the census, because it's really it's an uphill battle this year, and we can't do it without you partners. I did put that link on in the text box so that people can go there. If you need resources, if you need talking points, if you need to be able to find out how people are communicating, how organizations are communicating, or if you need support, or you want to sign up to be a partner and get these messages pushed out to you that you can then push out to your network, I encourage you to go there. It's easy, it's easy to do, it's 5 minutes, and you'll impact a lot of people that way.
Hansel.
Just a quick note, excellent responses. I just want to not necessarily speak to why there isn't a focus. I just want to also remind the importance of this. Like it's been stated, it's a little bit hard to conceptualize because it's done every 10 years and we don't see the immediate impact. But when we have situations like COVID, I think it's abundantly important that we have the accurate data. The CARES Act actually used census data to distribute the funds to different states and territories. So it's really important to make sure we have accurate counts, so when our states are in need of these resources, we can make sure we get the resources that we need.
Wow, thank you. Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, because
No
Hansel, thank you for bringing that up, Hansel, because he brought up a terrific point that we're dealing with now. On Tuesday, we had our last city council meeting virtually. We talked about the amount of money that Alexandria was getting from its initial kind of state give out from the CARES Act. Because of our numbers, we get a certain amount. But for example, our neighbor, Fairfax County, because they're such a large county, based on their census numbers, they got a certain automatic amount. I think it was about $250 million or something like that, to help them deal with CARES. But that was based solely on their census numbers. And so something like that, even during these times, still has a lot of effect, and undercount can definitely hurt that.
Well, thank you. I mean, each of you all brought your own unique perspective, and it was really enlightful to understand some really tangible, means for which the census can affect you, in your household and as an individual. So thank you each for those. Brother Councilman, there is another question with regard to funding. And the question is there a cap on federal funding, perhaps if the population grows beyond estimates?
You know what, I have never heard of that. Northern Virginia has grown in leaps and bounds over the last 20 years. And we haven't been capped. None of our jurisdictions have been capped on the amount of money that we receive. I don't know if Hansel might have any kind of better insight on this, but I don't believe there's a cap. I've never heard of that happening, even though we've seen great kind of change and transition within the Northern Virginia community.
I'm not familiar with that, but that's something certainly I can look into and pass it along to the moderators.
Great. Yes, please do so. So I would certainly say that, based on the discussion today and how active it's been, it certainly inspired some of our audience members to assess sort of how they can be involved and help promote the census. As Mr. Spain alluded to, this is very much a grassroots effort. So the question here is, with the census sort of enumeration process beginning on August 11th, which is delayed, Hansel, you referred to that. the online self-reporting being unavailable until October 31st, can individuals who may not necessarily be enumerators, kind of be proactive, get on kind of boots on the ground, start knocking on doors, perhaps going into hotspots to encourage community members to participate in the census? Or is that something that is sort of frowned upon and should be left to sort of those within an official governmental capacity?
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's actually one question that we receive a lot in the community. And this question really goes to the heart of the CCCs and the importance of their work that they do to complete count committees. They are our local volunteers and stakeholders that are kind of organizing the different efforts. So this is a good way, an opportunity to get plugged in to the complete count committee of your jurisdiction, whether it be Arlington or Alexandria, and find out what way you can contribute. One of the concerns in having individuals who aren't sworn, whether you may be good intention, there are individuals that might be bad intention, and those individuals may be willing to use that information in an inappropriate way. And in order to make sure that we streamline this process, we ask that the individuals that actually collect and go door to door, they have to be the census enumerators who have taken the oath, and they are liable for what information they collect and if there's any misuse of that information. So it's really important that if you are raising awareness, this kind of like a slippery slope in terms of the assistance that you're providing. Now, if you live if you're a caretaker or a caregiver, the situation might be a little bit different, but for having community members go knocking door to door, it may be good intention, well intentioned. It could be problematic in the sense that another individual might get the wrong idea and they may mistrust the system, and individuals who don't have the proper credentials are out in the community, and we could have some confusion. So I think that one of my recommendations would be definitely to, if you're interested in participating and getting more involved, get linked into your complete count community and find out what ways you can support.
Did anyone else on the panel want to add anything? Okay.
I just want to, it's related, but
Sure.
I really think it's important for us to get as much of the self-responding done before August 1st online. I am really skeptical about the census takers being able to do their job with COVID. I mean, I think that they may still have enough census takers to go out and knock on the doors, but I'm not so sure everyone's going to open their door. And I'm not sure that people are going to feel comfortable, safe distance, even in August or September to respond. So the more we can get people to respond online before the August deadline, the higher the rate will be. So that really has to be the push. And then if we do everything we possibly can, then after that, well, we just have to leave it to whether people will actually be counted in person given COVID-19. So please work with your networks to encourage people, and they can help people self-report online just as they could in person.
Great, thank you both for that. So, essentially, the greatest asset you can use here is certainly your voice and your network. The magnitude of, identifying someone else can be exponential if we all just continue to spread the word for self-reporting. So thank you for that. The next question is around non-citizens. So are there any risk for non-citizens completing the census?
If I may I think that the biggest risk that I communicate, the biggest risk is not participating in the sense that your community is going to be impacted. There are a lot of protections, confidentiality. There's Title 13. It has withstood Supreme Court challenges, the confidential aspect of the census. So this is something that's well steeped into our system. And I think that whether you're individual, whether you were born in this country or not, and you're living in the country, it's important for you to get counted. I just, the risks, there aren't any, because by law, this information cannot be, it cannot be shared with other organizations. I know we talked about different hard to count communities and some of the concerns that they may have. Another agency that the census does not share the information with housing. There might be individuals that have more individuals in their household than they're typically allowed to have. And you shouldn't be concerned that that information is going to get back to your landlord or going to get back to the housing agency if you have live under a particular program. All this information is protected. The information that's released is the statistical information. So to an individual that wasn't born in this country and is concerned, I would say that the bigger concern would be not counting and what that could mean for your community.
Absolutely. And I would just add that from the Complete Count Committee's perspective, we're reaching out to all the trusted advisors for immigrant groups and other groups, Black and brown groups, that can really express that it really is safe to take the census. And even though everything that's gone on with the news and the citizenship question and all of that, we just have to redouble our efforts that the trusted advisors provide that message. And most of the Complete Count committees have within their toolkit messaging for the trusted advisors would use with people who are skeptical, who are fearful of the federal government. And so hopefully if you check out those resources, that'll give you at least some talking points. But really it boils down to just having someone that you trust being able to give that message. It's okay to take the census, and it's highly encouraged.
Excellent. So this will be the last question before turning it back to George to perhaps obtain some closing remarks from each of our panelists. But this question actually comes from the chair of George Mason University's NAACP chapter. And I think this kind of, given the demographic that we all are likely reaching, there's a sort of a large component of individuals who may be this may be their first opportunity to participate in the census, specifically looking at college students. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on how to encourage college students who might be skeptical to complete the census, or maybe doing this for the first time and not appreciate what the impact is. Would someone like to address that?
Yeah, I'll start with that, Dale, and just share with you that since we've been going on with this, I've reached out to Elena Ruffin directly because she's a college chapter there at GMU. And we know it's just as important for our youth and our college students to be involved, not only in the census, but also in voting. And I can tell you, as a parent of a rising junior in college, that a lot of times their attention is not on census or even voting from time to time. So how we, again, articulate to them the level of importance that it is for them to participate is very important. And Elena, if you're looking, I've shared my telephone number with her. She's going to give me a call after this, and we're going to talk about what's going on out there at GMU, and hopefully give her get her in contact with a few people at NAACP state level to help out in that regard, because we do have a pretty large youth department for the state conference.
Great, thank you, Mr. Spain. All right, well, that concludes our public Q&A session, and I'll turn it back over to you, George.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, we really want to take an opportunity to specifically thank each of our panelists for joining us today. We'll also like you each to give some closing remarks, as well as any resources that you might want to share for our guests attending today as well. To start us off with the closing remarks, Mr. Hansel Aguilar, would you please go first in terms of.
I just want to thank you. I'm very honored to have been part of the discussion, and for the community members that were involved, thank you for being involved and participating in this process. Let's continue to get the word out. We received recent numbers today from my supervisor. We're split up in Virginia. It's called lanes, and we're leading our lane in the region, which is a good thing, but we're not at 100% count yet. So once we get to 100%, we can celebrate. And I just want to make sure that if there's any concerns or anything, feel free to contact either the moderators, feel free to contact me, Ms. Pierce, anybody, and we'll be able to guide you. And just a quick note about the college, because we didn't really go into that, and I know that that there's going to be a private discussion about that, but there's actually a different process too that we have for what's called group quarters, which those are college dorms, prisons, in hospitals, residential homes. Individuals that live in these kind of residencies, there's actually a different process than the rest of the country has. And where we work with the administrators of those particular facilities to make sure that we collect the data. So in the college setting, it actually both works ways, because we reach out to the residential components of the college, but there's also a reaching out to the community members who aren't living on campus. So just that's something to be mindful about. But thank you.
Thanks so much. And Ms. Pierce, would you like to give your closing remarks?
Sure. Well, thank you again to all the organizers for pulling this together. It's so important that we get this word out. The one thing I would leave with is that it really starts with each individual. So everyone, ask yourself, have you done your census yet? If you haven't, why not? And if it's something you're gonna get to it tonight. And then ask someone else if they've done theirs. And if they say, well, not yet, but we'll ask them when they're gonna do it. Because I think that's part of it, is that a lot of us, we mean to get to it, but we don't get to it. And so we have to be our own examples and go ahead and do that tonight if you haven't already done it, and then tell someone else. And so we want to really turn this into a viral campaign where we're using all of our networks to get this important message out. And it's so easy to do. It really is. There's no obstacle. There's no cost. You just have to log on and take the census.
So much for that. And Councilmember Chapman, would you like to give your closing remarks?
Certainly. First of all, I shared on the chat, I shared a link to Alexandra's efforts on the 2020 census. We do also have a complete count committee that is actually headed up by my colleague, Councilman Kanika Aguirre. And he has been leading the effort here in the city. And he has developed a 3-part presentation talking about talking about what we talked about today as about the local impact of the census. The next showing, and these are all done, of course, through Zoom calls. And so if you go to the website I showed on the chat, you can check this out. The next one is on Saturday, May 23rd at 3 p.m. I'm going to talk a little bit about the census in our schools, talking more directly about not only the direct funding that we get, but the impact of some of the nutrition programs that the census helps to fund. And so I implore you, much like everybody else here on this call has, to fill out your census. Find and call your family members, make sure they filled out their census, regardless of where they live. If you have friends, be a friend and bring up the fact that you need to fill out your census in a conversation. I know there are a number of Zoom calls happening and contacts happening over distance because we can't be with each other physically, but this is a perfect opportunity to ask a simple question: have you filled out the census? And for everybody here, the impact you make by doing that, and then asking somebody else to do it is going to be that much greater. So thank you for the opportunity to talk. Feel free to reach out to me individually if you have any questions about the census, what Alexandra's doing, or frankly, any other issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. And we'd love to give a special shout out to the Arlington branch of the NAACP for partnering with us on this. So Mr. Spain, we'll let you close us out with it.
Thank you, George, and to the brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, President Everett Ward, Chapter President Chris Jones. Thank you again for this collab event. Listen, representation is important. If you live in Arlington and Alexandria, you've earned and you're entitled to true representation. So participate in the census. To all my members, our members of the NAACP that are on the call and stick with us tonight, really appreciate it. This was a great discussion, great panel. We went deep in a lot of issues, substantive issues, but there's more we can do, right? So it's, I heard it takes a village to raise a child. It's going to take a village of like-minded individuals to ensure everyone participates in the census. And we're going to go out and do our part as the NAACP. I do want to also mention that we had someone on the call that I really appreciate. I reached out to him at the last minute, a gentleman by the name of Takas Kadonis. No need to, a lot of people in Arlington know who he is, but he stuck with us on the call the entire time. Says a lot about his quality and type of leadership. He's going to be one of our future leaders in Arlington, and understanding what the census is all about in this very inclusive community and what we're doing really means a lot. So again, guys, thank you. Send my regards to your leadership team. The NAACP is your partner, will remain your partner. And thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight.
And with that, back to Brother Conyers.
Well, again, we had a really dynamic panel tonight. It certainly resonated with me with regard to how the census really impacts each of us as individuals. So I hope you all feel inspired to go out and complete the census if you haven't already done so. I'd like to take just a brief moment to just thank my fraternity brother and line brother, DeGeorge Griffin, for moderating an excellent panel. And again, thank you to each of our panelists who joined tonight and all of our audience members. And with that, I bid you good night. Take care.
Peace. Good evening.
Good evening.